Thank you, Isabel, for that introduction. And Jay Odenbaugh, welcome to The Philosopher in the News. So, as Isabel has already said, there was this big Time magazine cover story last month. It was entitled The Return of the Dire Wolf. And this was the story about a species of wolf that had gone extinct about 10,000 years ago. And this private company called Colossal Biosciences claimed that it had somehow managed to bring the species back to life in the form of two very cute and very white wolf pups. So Jay, let's just start about on this story. Like many, including yourself, have questions about whether this was a proper case, as it were, of bringing back to life an extinct species. Can you tell us a little bit about your skepticism around this announcement before we get into the bigger questions about de-extinction?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you, Alexis. I suppose my skepticism grows out of a worry about what de-extinction is and what it takes for it to succeed. So when you think about de-extinction, you usually think about a species that, say, whose last living member has died and there are no current living members. And the idea would be you bring back something that's genealogically connected to that previous population, et cetera. And what happened with Colossal Biosciences is they took the DNA of gray wolves and they modified it in very sophisticated ways to generate something that essentially is kind of a look-alike, right? So it has the
Mm,
morphology of a dire wolf, long snout, musculature of a much larger wolf than a gray wolf, et cetera. But my worry is that you didn't actually resurrect an extinct species, but you created something that's a kind of simulacrum rather than
mm,
an authentic dire wolf.
mm. So that sort of goes into the sort of science of it, of de-extinction. We'll get to that in a little bit. But before we get into the kind of scientific possibility of de-extinction, what that would involve, there are some philosophers who claim that the extinction isn't even conceptually a possibility, right? That it's some kind of like conceptual paradox. And it seems a bit strange because most of us who have watched Jurassic Park, we think, okay, I understand what the extinction would amount to, you know.
Yeah.
So why do some philosophers think that this doesn't even make sense to begin with?
Yeah. Well, there's a kind of simple way to think about that skepticism, and then there's a more complicated way.
Mm,
And the simple way is that, if a species has gone extinct, isn't that just by definition mean that it could no longer exist, right? No matter what you do in the future, right? There's a simple response to that point, and that is, insofar as you have a genuine case of de-extinction, what you did was you thought the species had gone extinct, but in fact, you were just wrong about it, right? So
mm,
it's a kind of, in philosopher speak, it's a kind of epistemic issue, not a
right.
metaphysical. The more deep metaphysical issue concerns the nature of what a species is. And so if you think about what makes organisms parts of the same species over time, they have to be genealogically connected. So they have to be
Mm,
related, genetically. In other words, they have to be connected through some sort of heredity. Well, if de-extinction were to happen, what you might have is a group of organisms that cease to exist, woolly mammoths say, and then you have some new woolly mammoth, but it's not in any way genetically, hereditarily connected to that past. In
mm,
which case you have something that is very much like it, but it couldn't be the same thing because they're not related in the right way.
mm,
That's the basic, more principled and deep philosophical worry.
mm. But you don't agree with the sort of, I mean, the first point is easily dealt with. The second kind of more metaphysical point about if there's no connection between this new kind of species that we bring about with an extinct one, it doesn't really make sense to say that they're the same. What's the response to that? Is it that we need to think of de-extinction in slightly broader terms rather than there having to be some kind of causal connection or genealogical connection, as you put it, to the past species?
Yeah. So, it's useful actually to think about plants in this context,
Mm,
funny enough. So, there are plants that have seeds that are dormant for long periods of time and then only are fertilized and become living plants later. And so I would want to say during that period of dormancy, the species has gone extinct, right? What's happening in the case of de-extinction, there's a genealogical connection. It's facilitated through human technology, gene editing, cloning, etc. But there's periods of time where there are all no living exemplars of that species. So there's
Mm,
still that historical connection, but it's mediated by human technology, just like in the case of in vitro fertilization or something like that. And then, there's a way to connect those populations in the right sort of way. There's still worries about that. So, for example, consider the woolly mammoth.
mm,
What we would roughly do to create a woolly mammoth would be to modify Asian elephants and sort of using our knowledge of woolly mammoth DNA. And you might think, hybrids are fine, but what if you have something that's hairy and looks like a woolly mammoth, but it's mostly Asian elephant DNA, right? Is
mm,
that really something other than a mammothant rather than a genuine woolly mammoth? But in
mm.
principle, I don't see any reason why de-extinction could happen. In my own work, I've sort of distinguished between two ways of thinking about de-extinction. One, I just call revival. And that's the idea that you create something that looks very much like a past extinct species. So in the case of what's called the ORAC, right, you have the ancestors of all cattle, essentially. They're really big and they have big horns.
Mm.
Um, some people have actually modified current cattle to look like them by selecting for those distinctive traits. That's revival. Resurrection is a term I use for actually creating something like the original, and I think those are importantly different.
And what, yeah, you do say in your paper that you favor this kind of resurrection term instead of de-extinction. I mean, that might seem to some like an even higher bar because we think of resurrecting a particular, it might be like resurrecting a particular animal with its particular DNA rather than resurrecting a species. How should we think of this kind of concept in this
Sure.
context of, yeah.
Yeah, I think there's two issues there. I mean, one is, I felt a little bit guarded about that term because it has
Mm,
religious connotations and so on, and I didn't want that. But on the other hand, I think the potential of de-extinction and the way it's sold to us is being something of that kind of magnitude, right? We're doing something that is utterly remarkable, bringing back something from the dead. So in that sense, we're not bringing back particular organisms, right? We're not cloning an individual, but rather we're bringing back a species, a higher level of organization. And so in that sense, I think we should bill it for what it portends to be. And I think Resurrections captures that a little bit better.
mm. Before we get into the sort of science of how exactly that works and what exact sort of gene editing or recovery of DNA happens, there's this sort of like bigger kind of objection again, I guess, at this sort of like metaphysical, um, at the metaphysical level, questioning whether this is even possible. So, say it is possible to, recreate a species that is genetically identical to, the woolly mammoth or to the dire wolf in the case that we've been talking about. Some people say, well, species are not just their genes. That's just a very reductionist way of thinking about
Yeah.
it. Species are these kind of historical entities, right? They are what they are because they existed in a certain time and place. They had a certain environment. They had elders that would, teach the pups how to, go out and hunt and so on. So, as much as we can, maybe through science create a species that is genetically identical, it would never really be the same species because species is something broader than the genetic kind of makeup. What do we think about that objection?
Yeah. It's a really important objection. I think so. Some of the proponents of de-extinction waffle a bit about what the nature of species are. So there are some who
Mm,
give accounts like I did, roughly thinking about species in terms of interbreeding, right? Or at least some sort of hereditary relationship. And there are others who think of it more morphologically, and sometimes even the very same person can have two minds on that topic, right? If it looks enough like a duck and quacks like a duck, and it's a duck, right? Um, but there's another component here, which is behavior. And
mm,
these are phenotypic traits, but in a much broader sense. So, for example, imagine we could use genetic cloning to bring back the passenger pigeon, as people like Stuart Brand and Ben Novak would like. One of the things that they're elders, as you put it, taught, young passenger pigeons was how to migrate and how to travel from north to south and back and forth. And
Mm,
so, absent that set of behavior, then it's not clear that you actually have a passenger pigeon. Now, there are thoughts that Novak, for example, has suggested that you could train passenger pigeons to migrate properly through using homing pigeons, et cetera. And maybe that would work. Same thing with the dire wolf, right? So if dire wolves never predate in the ways that they on mega herbivores as they would have in the past, do you have a dire wolf? Are you missing some really important trait of it, even though it looks quite a bit like it? It may even be genetically connected in the right sort of way.
mm. And so I mean, these are questions, but what do you think about it? Do you think we can say that absent of certain behavioral traits, we can still say this is the same species, or
I'm inclined to sort of reject that morphological view that
mm,
merely having the right phenotypic appearance is sufficient. I'm even skeptical that just being genetically identical is
mm,
sufficient, precisely because, if we had the technology to clone a past organism, but we did it through actually manipulating DNA that's not really connected to the past. I'm suspicious that's the same thing. So it's
mm,
that hereditary begetting relation that I think is crucial. So the functional behavior. So imagine that you have a species that's threatened or endangered, and it lives in a zoo, right? I want to say it's a member of the same species. It's just that it's not functioning in the way that
mm,
traditionally they would. And so I think insofar as we have an authentic dire wolf, it's a dire wolf. It just happens to live on a preserve, right? Or if a passenger pigeon can't migrate, I want to say it's a passenger pigeon. Because of the right genetic connection, but it's missing crucial traits that we associate with that. And you might think lacking some of those behaviors is a sufficient reason to not try to bring them back, right? Because they won't exist in the right
mm.
sort of environment,
Yeah,
exhibit their characteristic behavior.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I guess even in the case of the Homo sapiens, right? I mean, our behavior has probably changed quite drastically over the last few tens of thousands of years, and we would still like to say that we're the same species as the first kind of Homo sapiens, even though we exhibit very different behaviors, but there is that kind of unbroken genealogical link, as you say. Can you tell us before we move into the kind of questions about why would someone want to do this in the first place, and the kind of big ethical questions around it? Can you tell us a little bit more about the science? We've talked a little bit about gene editing, that we can only do this with certain species, that we have enough remnants of their DNA that we can kind of sequence it in some ways. Can you tell us a little bit about how the science behind all this is supposed to work?
Sure. There are usually three different techniques that are associated with de-extinction. With the auroch, I mentioned you're basically doing selective breeding. That's sort of, backbreeding is what they call it. And that's what, agriculturists have used, for time immemorial. And that's not unusual. The sort of the thing that makes de-extinction so much more of a live possibility now is what's called somatic cell nuclear transfer. And essentially, what you do is you take the genome of a relative of some species, a target species that you want to, basically resurrect, and you modify that genome such that it has the characteristic traits of the long gone ancestor. And then what you end up doing is, I mean, there's a lot of steps, of course, but basically that genome is implanted in an enucleated cell. So in the case of the dire wolf, they basically went to about 14 genes at 20 sites, if I remember right, and modified those genes. And what they did was then took a nucleus of a gray wolf, right, where they modified those genes, and they enucleated an egg of a gray wolf mother, placing that inside, and then essentially you bring that to term as an embryo, and they put it in sort of essentially big hound dogs, right? Because they knew
Mm,
that the to carry such a large animal, you need a really big canine.
mm,
And so that's the somatic cell nuclear transfer. It involves genetic editing, transferring the cell into a nucleated egg. The third is just essentially genetic cloning. So in a way, you create the DNA almost from scratch.
Hmm.
This is really important for reptiles and birds because they don't reproduce in the same way that mammals do. If you think about the construction of an egg and yolk and all this, there's no exact place where you can modify in the way that you would with mammals. And so essentially what you do is you modify stem cells that will later become germ cells and then develop into, ultimately some sort of bird or reptile. So those are really the three ways in which it's done. And most of the action is happening in that middle one. But there are plenty
Hmm.
of people who hope that things like passenger pigeons and so on will eventually result
Yeah, from this second method. Yeah,
from the third, right? Genetic
from the
cloning.
third.
Yeah,
Genetic cloning, yeah, right. Sorry, yeah, you mentioned that for birds, you can't really follow the second method. Yeah, I mean, all this sounds quite wild that science has come to the point where they can play around with the genetic material of gone species in this way. Um, and it sounds very sci-fi, but obviously people are already doing it and think that they can do more of it in the near future. One of the more discussed cases is this case of the woolly mammoth that you mentioned earlier. And you said that the way we would do it would be through kind of um, through breeding sort of through Asian elephants. And we have, I think, the woolly mammoth is around extinct also for around 10,000 years, like the dire wolf. And we have kind of bits of its DNA pretty much intact because of the fact that they lived in really, really cold places and helps with preservation. But this comes to this kind of question about like, why would you even want to do this in the first place? And in the case of the woolly mammoth, is quite a wild sort of story about how they might, help end climate change, basically. Can you tell
right.
us about
Sure.
how bringing back the woolly mammoth can help with climate change?
Yeah, I think if you think about any of these target species, some of them, the reason would be something like, well, it would be really cool, right? So the passenger pigeon, for example,
Mm,
according to journals from, many, many, many years ago, they would blanket the sky and turn it dark and so on. And the justification might be it would just be really cool to see those things, right? In the case of the woolly mammoth, I think it's sort of the exemplar of the strongest case you can make. And the idea here is that, in the past, in tundra or sort of the mammoth steppe, as they sometimes call it, woolly mammoths occupied a really important ecological engineering role. And so what they would do is sort of knock over trees and tamp down snow. And one of the things that, as a side effect of that, it prevents permafrost melt. And many climate scientists worry because methane, et cetera, is a really potent climate changing gas, has a lot of impact on the climate, that if we reintroduce wolves there, or wolves, if we introduce mammoths there, right, what that would do is actually prevent permafrost melt and
mm,
ultimately forestall sort of runaway climate change. And that's a very sensible thought, right? And so you could do this in Siberia. So the last populations of woolly mammoths were found in Siberia and also off Alaska. And one of the things that's interesting about that is just a little bit of a side note on the genetics is that DNA degrades over time. And after about 1.5 million years, you can't recover information from that DNA. If you're lucky, you can harvest information of that DNA, up until that point, but generally it starts decaying in a way that's almost irretrievable after about, a couple 10,000 years. So one thing that's wonderful about the woolly mammoth is we have these, really well-preserved specimens because they were in the cold. And so reconstructing the genetics is actually not the technically most difficult aspect. It will involve, for example, figuring out how to get a large enough population to move them there and so on, right? Because the world has changed quite a bit.
yeah, which I mean brings us in some ways to the kind of next question, which is, okay, this sounds really cool, and it would maybe be amazing to see in real life what woolly mammoths look like, and if they can help, with climate change at the same time, that's a massive bonus. But people start bringing up again. not to keep banging on about Jurassic Park, but that's the kind of like paradigm in people's mind about this, which is that, well, when you're starting to play around with these things and you're reintroducing kind of gone species, you don't really know what's going to happen. There might be unintended consequences. We think that reintroducing these woolly mammoths would, help prevent the permafrost from melting, but maybe they'll exhibit new behaviors that we haven't predicted or couldn't imagine, and can lead to even more catastrophic results. So what's this? This is a kind of argument against playing God, right? I think in the literature, it's more described as this kind of the hubris objection of like, we
Hmm.
don't know what we're doing with this. We better just, stay away from it because who knows what's going to happen. Um, you don't think that's a very good objection. Why is that?
Well, I think there are sort of two issues here. The first is that if you really are worried about these genetic technologies, then you should worry about them wherever they're found.
Mm,
And I think it's very clear that they have potential impacts, positive ones for humans, for example. So there's a story just a week or two ago of a 9-month-year-old child who's had a particularly worrisome genetic malady, which would basically they couldn't remove ammonia from their body. And using targeted gene editing, doctors, medical professionals actually remove that genetic defect, and that child will live.
mm,
If you're skeptical of genetic technologies, these sort of synthetic biotechnology, then presumably you should be skeptical across the board, right? Or you have to find some principled reason why it's okay here and not there. So I don't have any uh, a priori worries about the technology. I think it's a question of the particular manifestations and uses. In the case of woolly mammoths, you know, we're talking about places that, tundra, where woolly mammoths are not running roughshod over cities and so forth. The targeted role of what they would be doing is fairly circumscribed. So I do think that you can find cases where the benefits would be potentially quite great. Talking about runaway climate change, we need to use all the tools at our disposal. So I'm not the hubris objection. I think one, most of us are not going to be skeptical of the technology across the board. And two, I think we can quiet some of those worries when we look at the particular cases that are being proposed.
mm. I mean, to go back to this question of environment and behavior that we talked about earlier, I mean, in this case, if we were able to bring back to life the woolly mammoth, would we have to do other things as well to try and recreate the kind of environment that they would have existed in 10,000 years ago? Presumably, other things have changed in those places since then. And would that be possible? Would we be able to like try and recreate an environment that then would trigger the same kinds of behaviors that they would have exhibited,
Right.
back then?
So, these are herbivores, and so you'd have to have plants that they could consume in mass to, feed those large diets.
Mm,
There would have to be, I'm one of the peculiar things about de-extinction, of course, is you're starting with really small populations, right? So another question is
mm,
just, can you get those populations large enough to have the effect intended?
right.
And that's not always obvious. So, there's a variety of those kinds of worries. Those can be big. For me, they seem to be issues of practical concern, not so much something like, is it infeasible, but rather could you put it together? I mean, so I'm sympathetic to those worries, but
Mm,
I don't think that
we're
we
there
can
yet.
write off precisely. Yeah. Yeah.
So another thing that people worry about is that this sort of muddies the waters of conservation efforts more broadly, right? So this is a very expensive kind of technology. A lot of resources would presumably go that way if people had better results, and therefore presumably there'd be like fewer resources going in the direction of more traditional conservation, trying to prevent living endangered species from going extinct. And the other thing, I don't know if that comes up, but I guess it also in some ways lowers the stakes of extinction. You think, well, if a species goes extinct, it's not a big deal. Some scientists will be able to bring it back in the future, and so we shouldn't really care about this kind of issue of trying to keep our existing species alive. We can always just, well, maybe we need to have a very careful kind of genetic bank of them, in the way that I think there is one for plants. Again, somewhere
Yes.
very cold in the in the Arctic. So what do you make of that argument that this is a sort of, in some ways, is a technology that is presents itself as a kind of like conservationist technology, but maybe the effects will be the opposite?
There's sort of two concerns I have. I mean, the first of which is um, it can inculcate in people a belief that extinction's not forever, right? And
Mm,
so for any given species that's gone, give us some time and we'll bring it back, right? So it in a way desensitizes us to the threats to biodiversity that's currently threatened and endangered. Uh, and that's a legitimate worry, I think. But as I say, DNA degrades fairly regularly, and after, let's say 1.5 million years, you can't extract information from it to recreate, resurrect, or even revive the species of interest. Dinosaurs are not coming back, right? And so there is a small band of cases that where the extinctions are recent enough that these technologies could be deployed. But in truth, they won't be employed in mass. And so I think insofar as the public comes to believe that extinction is not forever, I think that would be a problematic thing for them to think. The second thought is groups like Revive and Restore, Colossal Biosciences. These are groups that are very much centered on de-extinction, but they also contribute to conservation more generally. So, for example, Colossal Biosciences has made a special point to, work on problems like genetic bottlenecks. So, when populations
mm,
become genetically homogeneous, you can worry that they more they're great at greater risk for extinction. And so, how can you introduce more genetic variety? Right, these very same techniques could possibly be used. So I think many of these folks are not only concerned with de-extinction and all the resources they employ will go to these things. They also are interested in conservation more generally. But I do think in the public imagination, we begin to think, oh, well, conservation, it's a low stakes thing because we can bring things back. I think that's one danger of the public image of de-extinction for sure.
mm. Okay, one last objection before we get to like a kind of more positive maybe approach towards this and why it might be a good idea to do it. People worry about animal welfare, right? This is a experimental technology. When you start introducing it, things might go wrong. You might end up with species that um, are diseased, or a few animals that are diseased, or can't reproduce, or have very short lifespans, and basically is not lives that are not very good for the animals in question. And to sort of tag that with another consideration, which I think may be slightly misplaced or anthropomorphizing this kind of question, but I was wondering, like, if humanity for some reason goes extinct, as it probably will, would we want some kind of alien culture, bringing us back to life in a world where our environment was very different, and we couldn't do the things that we did as a kind of human species while we were around? Would we welcome that kind of change? So I don't know. What are your thoughts on these two kind of questions?
Sure. I think one of the things that's really interesting that both of these things raise is the question about, what's the wrong of a species going extinct?
Mm,
What's the moral disvalue, if you like, of that? And I think when I ref just my own first person sort of thought here, when I think about humans going extinct, which 99.9% of all species have gone extinct, we will. Question is
mm,
when, and presumably how. But I don't have a strong gut reaction to the idea that eventually there'll be no humans. But I
mm.
do think if you think species, especially extinctions that are human caused,
Yeah.
should be, remediated or something, then I do think that, de-extinction serves as a really important tool. So, if we take your example and run with it a bit, imagine that humans go extinct because of our own short-sightedness, just to put it that way, from climate change or any other,
Likely. Yeah.
yes, yes, some form or fashion, right? You might think that giving a second run at it would be worthwhile, right? We could learn from our errors and so on. And I'm not opposed to that idea. I think, seed banks are wonderful resources. Would it be
Mm,
useful to have such a thing for humans? I'm not opposed to that. The one thing going to the issue of suffering that I think is very interesting and thinking about it in the context of the dire wolf, many people worry about de-extinction because in order to create a viable living organism, those organisms probably, many will die in order to create that one that hangs around, or
mm,
that two or three. Um, there's, classic examples, the Picardo, which is a member, a subspecies of the ibex. They brought one back for, very short period of time, but because it had lung deformities, it died a painful death of essentially asphyxiation. Why would we create something that's going to suffer that badly?
mm,
Or why would we create a very small population, which is be by definition endangered and probably invasive because it lives in a place that's not its home? Why would we create something only to go extinct twice? Or in
mm,
the direwolf cave, why would we create something that's on a preserve where they don't like humans and they're fed, meat, in a completely artificial environment in which they don't exhibit the very traits that we love them for? So I think these are real concerns. I don't think that they're,
mm.
the fact that we can obviously doesn't imply that we should.
You mentioned earlier that, especially in the cases of extinction that has had a human hand involved in it, there's a sort of a more positive case for making to bring those species back because it was our fault, something we did, let's kind of right that wrong. This brings up this kind of interesting question of having a sort of moral obligation not to kind of specific animals that we've harmed by, removing their environment or destroying their environment or, overfishing them or killing them, whatever the case might be for each species, but that we somehow have a duty, a moral duty to the species as a whole to like bring it back. How do we make sense of that? How do we make sense of responsibilities towards other species rather than other kind of specimens of that species?
That's a very good question and a very hard one in a way. So if you think about it in the human case, I think that's probably the best place to start
Mm,
to kind of warm up your intuitions, as it were. So I have obligation. I have an obligation to my son, Everett, in part because he's my son, right? It's not just because he's an arbitrary individual, but
mm,
rather because I'm related to him in certain ways. And it's those relationships between things that often ground the moral obligations we have. And so they're not just obligations to, individuals per se. They can be, but often those thick relationships that happen between humans in virtue of being related to one another, et cetera, can ground the moral obligations we have. And I think, when we think about species are not just a set of individual organisms. It's in virtue of these relationships, genealogical and otherwise, that they have that make them the species they are. And so when we think about why does an endangered species matter more morally than, say, one that's abundant, it's precisely because those relationships have been, torn and reduced that we
mm,
think that we have some special obligation over and above, to the individuals. That's a really kind of short answer, but I think the reasons are sort of lie in that nexus. It's the relations that matter, not merely the individuals
mm.
in which those relations, take place.
Yeah. I thought you were going to go in a different direction when you brought in human relations and how they ground our moral obligations. Because I thought, well, we have this concept of, for example, crimes against humanity. It's not just, crimes against individual people that have been committed, but these are, crimes against our kind of species as a whole, and somehow that makes it even worse, or there's a kind of heavier moral weight to some actions when they're categorized as that.
Well, as a kind of another way of thinking about this, think about, imagine watching a group of swifts flying in a kind of murmuration, which
Mm,
is this really beautiful, sort of flocking behavior, aesthetically remarkable. What I value about it is not the fact that all of the individuals happen to be in certain positions. It's rather they're responding to each other in this sort of synergistic way. similarly with organisms, right? When I see wolves hunt, what I'm valuing in some sense is that synergistic behavior, the fact that one will run ahead to push that prey in a certain direction, the others are waiting. It's this really remarkable. It's something. If you like the term emergent, you could talk about emergence here, but there's
Mm,
something more than just the individuals. And I don't think you have to have a wildly platonic view of things about species and so on. There are properties and relationships that are over and above any individual.
mm. So maybe this response feeds into my final question before we open up to a Q&A. Um, Another argument for kind of the value, the potential value of de-extinct of the process of de-extinction is the value, the intrinsic value of ecological diversity. That is somehow there's an inherent value that we should do everything that comes, that everything that we're able to do to preserve biodiversity, and not only that, but actively promote it through kind of bringing back species that have gone extinct. How can we make sense of this kind of like intrinsic value of biodiversity? And I'm asking that because I think a lot of the time when we're thinking about the importance of biodiversity, it is mostly in instrumental terms, right? We think, well, there's an intricate balance in our ecological system, and biodiversity plays a huge role in this. And like if we disrupt that, then there are bad consequences kind of come about that. And we talk about that in the case of animals. We also talk about that in the case of crops, for example. We're against kind of monocultures because they disrupt a kind of like balance in nature. So if we put that kind of instrumental reasons for valuing biodiversity aside, what are the kind of intrinsic, what's the intrinsic value of biodiversity? How do we make sense of that?
This is probably, in the context of environmental ethics, one of the more difficult questions because it cuts to the quick of exactly what the nature of value is. And
Mm,
so, a kind of classic thought experiment in environmental ethics is imagine, you're the last human on the planet, and you have the opportunity to cut down the last, redwood tree. Is there anything wrong with doing that? And if you say, well, it would, then other future humans won't see it. If there are no future humans, then, it wouldn't be
mm,
wrong. So some people think of intrinsic value as the value something has independent of any valuation whatsoever. And then the question is, why would you think that organisms, non-human organisms, non-sentient organisms, so plants, say, or collectives like species and ecosystems could have that? A common answer given by philosophers who are sort of friendly to that view is there's something about the goal-directed behavior, the teleology of these systems that grounds that intrinsic value. And that's a really interesting thought. The worry here is, of course, that it's not clear that some of these collectives are goal-directed in the right sort of way. Like an ecosystem didn't evolve by natural selection to increase in biomass, et cetera. There's a lot of arguments to be had there, but the worry is that that teleological answer won't work. My own view is influenced by another philosopher, Katie McShane, and the thought is that one way of thinking about intrinsic value is actually thinking about it as a way in which we value things, a way in which we value things for their own sake.
mm,
So it's not so much that the value exists independent of us, but rather it's value that we contribute, as it were, to the world in virtue of valuing things for their own sake. And her kind of usual example of this kind of valuing is love. I love my son, and I think he's worthy of love. But the question is not so much as, does value exist independent of all minds? That's not really the helpful way to think about it, but it's rather what's the proper attitude to take towards these things. And if you begin to think about the natural world, and if you have attitudes of awe and respect, love, etc., think about places you've been, species you care about. I think that's a very natural way of thinking about intrinsic value. There's a lot more questions to be asked and hammered out,
mm,
but I think that's a useful and plausible way to think.
mm. Hard to, I mean, I know you want to kind of issue that kind of idealist, almost kind of objection, right? Like if no one's around, like what even is value? If there's no one around to love, what do we mean really by the intrinsic kind of value of love?
Right.
But maybe we can park it at that for now and maybe come back later if we have more time.
Well, I would
Jay,
say just one quick thing.
yeah.
You can value states of affairs in which you're not present, and there are no humans, right? And so this view I think, can address some of those worries. But like you say, we can park it there.
Hmm. Yeah, depends how serious we take that kind of Berkeley thinking that, well, we're still thinking of it, even when we're
Right.
thinking of
Sure.
something
Sure.
existing without us around, without anyone perceiving it, we're still somehow perceiving it in our mind.
Yes.
Jay, that was terrific. Thank you very much for this conversation. We have quite a few questions. The first one, I think, brings it from the animal kingdom back to the human one. This is from Elka Nola. It says, if it's acceptable ethically to de-extinct a four-legged mammal, why then not a human? We seem to have ethically accepted cryonics. The concepts are very similar. I guess the question is not about extinction in the sense of because humans are not extinct, but sort of this kind of resurrecting individuals in the future potentially through a similar kind of technology. So do you
Yeah.
think if we accept one, we sort of already have accepted implicitly the other one?
Well, I think bringing back species, right, is not to bring back particular individuals. And so I don't think it immediately follows that if
Mm,
you think it's permissible to de-extinct species, that bringing back dead humans, say, immediately follows. But the question would be, for me, I think it's a really interesting one. I think one question I would have is what's the rationale for that, right? So think about it in the context of long gone pets. Even if you brought back a clone, there was a question of is it the same individual?
mm,
And if you spend any time reading about personal identity and so forth, these are very nuanced things. So, for example, some people think that I am who I am because I'm connected to my past through memory to previous stages of me, put it that way. And so, absent those memories, even if you have something that's genetically like me, it's not me because it doesn't have the same psychological continuity. So, I do think this is a really great question, but I guess I'm not convinced that you accept de-extinction. You're going to find yourself saddled with that.
the two are separate enough, yeah.
It could be.
What do you see as being the ethical challenges that come up in this case of resurrecting individual, whether it's animals or humans, I guess, right? You might be able to resurrect a particular kind of animal from the past. Are there new ethical questions that might arise there? Apart from the metaphysical question, is it really the same? Is it not? I guess, as you say, it gets quite complicated quite quickly, but
It does.
are there new moral kind of considerations that we have to take into account?
I do. I mean, I guess I'm inclined to, the first thing, when the question came up, I began to think about was, what's that rationale? So, well, why do I care about, I mean, what about the rationale am I worried about? I think, suppose, one of our, a spouse dies, and the thought is, well, I can bring them back. Some of the worries about de-extinction will reappear, namely, is it them? That's what we were
Mm,
talking about a second ago. But a second is, um, how does that transform my attitudes towards the death of loved ones? If
mm,
if in life I think I can always bring them back or they can bring me back, how does that thin out what it means to care about others and the significance of death? It's not to say that we shouldn't do it, but I worry that for example, when people bring back pets or want to bring back pets, right? What we want is a kind of bringing back something impossible, namely the nature of that relationship I had before. Bringing
mm,
back that individual doesn't reestablish that relationship, and it's that relationship in which the value between the individuals accrues. So I'm worried that we're then susceptible to a lot of muddled thinking about our
mm,
relationships and our attitudes towards one another.
mm. Yeah, interesting. This idea that yeah, the kind of finitude or mortality of human life or even animal life is part of what kind of grants it meaning in some ways or grants special status to a relationship between individuals. Okay, let's move on. Tom Lopolo has a few questions. So, going to the original case of the dire wolf, they say, assuming the new dire wolf was brought back, would it be kept in captivity? I assume it is at the moment. If introduced in the wild, wouldn't that be unfair to the prey species who would have lost thousands of years to evolve or maintain defensive measures? And on the flip side, if the dire wolf were to be kept in captivity, wouldn't that present this kind of same questions for the dire wolf in that case?
Yeah, great question. The three dire wolves that currently exist, Romulus, Remus, and Khaleesi,
Oh yeah.
are in an undisclosed location for lots of reasons, of course. I think you're exactly right, Tom, that if you bring back animals like this, then the question is, what are they going to prey on? What are they going to eat? It seems morally wrong to bring them back only to keep them on a preserve, but it also seems if you reintroduce them into the wild, they're going to, go after things that did not adapt evolutionarily to predators like this.
Mm,
So alongside, what you're going to have to do is have prey that actually are, in some sense, um, can deal with a predator like a direwolf. That is, and because the worry, of course, is the direwolf would just run, into extinction, all sorts of prey that otherwise would, not have gone extinct. One thing that's interesting about the story of the direwolves, with animals like this, the story of why they went extinct is fairly complicated. We know climate change had a certain point in it with
mm,
ice age, change, and we know that the loss of big mega herbivores also contributed, but presumably humans also contributed to that, et cetera.
mm.
But one thing that's interesting, according to some scientists, is it's possible dire wolves were also outcompeted by gray wolves. And if that's correct, it's interesting to wonder how well would dire wolves do in a world in which, at least in the North American context, there are gray wolves that have been reintroduced. They may not fare particularly well. So I
Mm.
think their size and so on makes you think, well, they'll dominate terrestrial ecosystems, but it's not obvious because they were adapted to a
Yeah.
very specific past.
Yeah, that's I guess another type of objection, right, against doing this, which is that you're just fighting evolution. Just, you can't fight the powers of evolution. If a species has gone extinct out of, natural processes, of course that introduces a whole other kind of bag of questions about like are interventions natural processes or not, but let's park
Sure.
that aside for now. But yeah, if they just a species just went extinct because yeah another species kind of dominated the environment or outcompeted it in some kind of way, then if we're bringing them back, aren't we just then going to end up with the same place? We're fighting a kind of losing battle. Okay, there are a few other questions that what one Tom has another question about gene editing, but not maybe we'll come to it in a bit if we have time. But Elka Nola asks a question in terms of identity, I guess that we were touching upon earlier in terms of what makes us who we are and the role that memory plays in that. And she asks what the how do we make sense of people with dementia who are quite separated from their memories? Um, do we think they're the same person that they were when they were healthy and had their full kind of set of memories and or not full, but like a normal human
Right.
that doesn't suffer from dementia?
Yeah, I think, one of the really interesting things when we think about what makes an organism, human or otherwise, involves, we've been talking about genetics and we've been sort of amping up the idea that, your identity in part is determined by your genetics and your genetical relations with others. But there's a lot of relational features or properties that you have that go into who you are that are not, merely biology based. So we start thinking about psychology. I was talking about a Lockean view about how persons are persons because they share memories over
Mm,
time. I think from that point of view, someone who his mind, exhibits that kind of loss of memory, you might think that they're not the same person anymore. And so I think some of our reactive attitudes towards people who suffer from conditions like that often mirror it in the sense of they look the same, but they're not
mm,
fully, it's not them. There are other views about the nature of identity, which are related to bodily identity and so on, which would actually say something different. But I think those are really in the context of biology, there's a lot of discussion about epigenetics and sort of extragenetic resources that are come along with organisms. I just happened to see a documentary in which panda bears, for panda to digest bamboo, they have to have some of the microbiome that their mothers have, and the only way that can be passed is the mother gives it to them in their saliva. And so
Mm,
there are ways in which they almost look like they're being affectionate and kissing when they're not. The mother's transferring saliva into the gut of her offspring. That's crucial to the idea of that panic. If they can't eat bamboo, then they can't survive. But that's not part of their DNA per se.
yeah, but an essential trait to what that animal is. And I guess in the case of dementia as well, I mean, people obviously lose a big part of their memories. Very rarely do they lose all of their memories, I think, right? There are these like episodic memories, usually from the deep past rather than kind of more recent times. And again, you might say, well, no other person has that relationship to those memories but that person. And so in some ways they are the same, even if, the continuity has been interrupted or is not as intact as it would
And you
otherwise
could
be.
also, from my little knowledge of this, what I've heard is that there are things that trigger those past memories particularly effectively, like music. So
Mm,
there are contexts in which you can play music that the person was familiar with and loved, and that can actually bring back capacities that they would lack. So it's actually changing the environment that brings that person into play in a way that mere physiology kind of doesn't, right?
mm, mm. Um, if Assis asks something, I think we've touched upon this. I don't know if you have anything to add further about the question of is it morally permissible to bring back a species if the environment that they would have existed in has changed since they went extinct? And yeah, what do we think of that?
I think the probably the way I would come down on that is if a species, if you bring something back that for which there is no analog environment, so there's not either that environment or one suitably
Similar
similar,
enough.
then I think you shouldn't. One of the things I mentioned earlier was, what could be worse than going extinct once, but twice, right? And I think if you bring back a species only to have them disappear again, that seems egregious and unwarranted. Um, so I think this is a serious sort of issue. We don't think that conservation is just keeping things around in zoos and aquaria and the
Mm,
like.
mm, mm. Sumesh asks, what about the ethics of potential use of DNA editing to create an entirely new animal that is genetically unrelated to any animal past or present, which would be essentially a kind of alien species? I don't know if it can be completely unrelated to any animal, but I guess you could imagine the creation of hybrid species which haven't existed before and don't exist currently.
Yeah. I mean, I could imagine, arguments for creating microbial life that could perform certain kinds of ecosystem services, decomposition
Eat
or
plastic.
certain,
Yeah.
precisely.
Yeah.
And that you could imagine that those technologies could possibly do that, and the argument for it would actually be fairly strong. Now, of course, there are all the worries about side effects and unforeseen consequences and the like, but I don't think if now, however, if someone's thinking about creating sentient or intelligent life, then I think the worries are multiply. But I think thinking about it in microbial case, I think there could be a case to be made there
Mm. Yeah, well, otherwise we're going back to kind of Frankenstein-like kind of scenarios of, yeah.
for sure, for sure.
Um, okay, Frank has a question. I read an article from one of the chief scientists involved in this saying plainly that they were not resurrecting the dire wolf that they had merely created was nothing other than genetically engineered grey wolf. In either case, it's morally abominable to me, but I'd appreciate your thoughts. Read the former. And there are already three pups. I heard that as well. Yeah, I think we've kind of touched on most of these things, right? We did say it isn't quite bringing the same direwolf species back. It is a kind of even amongst the de-extinction kind of possibilities, quite low down on the kind of scale.
One
Um,
quick thought on that. One of the things I've noticed is that some proponents of de-extinction originally started with a view of species, basically an interbreeding view that we talked about, but they've softened to sort of morphological view so that if it looks like the thing, that's sufficient for it to be the thing. And that seems convenient if what you're trying to do is promote a technology. And so I do worry that
mm,
intellectually there's a bit slip and slide where
some hype.
they, they've lowered the standards precisely because if you want to say you created a dire wolf, it's not sufficient. You created a very interesting looking gray wolf, right? That's not the same thing. And so I
Mm,
do think
mm.
there's a little bit of softness in some of these views that's happening precisely because of the commercial appeal and potential for financial reward, I think.
Yeah, I guess that's something we didn't really touch on. Like, do we, irrespective of the kind of ability of the technology or the kind of broader kind of ethical questions, do we care about who's doing this and for what, like, is it okay for private enterprises to do it for reasons that, remain unclear to the rest of us? They might have certain plans that we're not, what do we think about the kind of agency behind who's bringing about these changes?
In many respects, in many respects, I think these are some of the newer worries I have about de-extinction that when I
Mm,
wrote the original piece that sort of informs our conversation, I wasn't thinking about as much. But so here's the sort of thought. Colossal Biosciences created these three dire wolves out of sight, in a sense, right? They're a
mm,
private company. They edited these genes, created these animals, and they say that they did so in a humane way, et cetera, et cetera. But there's no real oversight, right? There is a peer-reviewed paper to appear which documents the process and so forth, but this is private capital, private corporations doing this sort of thing. So I think if this were done by government-funded oversight science, the sort of traditional way we think about science, you might think that's one thing. But if you let private companies, firms do this, kind of willy-nilly, the potential for harm is far greater, I think. And I think oversight, um, in all manner of ways, I think is really important for these kinds of projects. And I worry about what happens when, any Tom, Dick, and Harry can decide to try this out and see what happens, right? Obviously, it requires a lot of capital, a lot of technology, and so forth. So not anybody's going to do it. But I do worry if it just happens at the hands of any interested corporation, what we'll end up with. This is why Jurassic Park is
mm.
problematic in part because it's people doing something for financial gain and for curiosity without anybody overseeing it, really.
Zeno, I think we've covered the question that you're asking in the Q&A and the main talk, so you can listen back when we upload this onto the Philosopher YouTube channel, and we'll upload these new episodes on the usual the Philosopher in the News podcast channels as well. Let's end with this question by Tom, which is kind of introducing a sort of like reverse process of like if we can edit species back into existence, maybe we can edit species into extinction as well. And sometimes maybe we would like to do that. In the case of mosquito, I think this is something that has been discussed about editing them in some modifying their genome in such a way that prevents them from carrying malaria. I think other cases are for preventing them from um, being able to um, have ancestors. So, what do we think about? I mean, it's a whole other set of moral considerations, I guess, but what do we think about that? What do you think about this? In some ways, I guess, goes against this idea of biodiversity is great for biodiversity's sake, and obviously making a species extinct would go against that. But
Yeah,
what
it's a
if
great
the kind of
question.
outcomes are, morally that a whole kind of disease that wipes out, thousands of people every
Yeah.
year goes away?
So one of the things that when I think about de-extinction, the cases where I think it gets the most traction is trying to ameliorate, address harms of the past. So if humans drive a given species extinct, you think to ameliorate that harm, bring them back would be a proper response. But now we're considering cases where there are harms that may have nothing to do with us. Should we intervene? I think in
Mm,
the case of malaria and mosquitoes, it's a really fascinating case because, using CRISPR, particular kind of genetic technology, you can, basically create eventually sterile mosquitoes that die and don't
Mm.
transmit that disease, and that would, save, millions of lives. So, I'm inclined to think that, if we can rule out side effects, that is something worth doing. Now, here are some of the side effects I worry about. So, one of the things I wouldn't want is those genes that lead to sterility, et cetera, to be passed into populations of other mosquitoes that don't transmit,
Mm.
malaria, et cetera, right? So there are things like that, but those are ones that you would think about. But I do think that, it could also be the case. Imagine that you have invasive species that invade New Zealand, right, where you have this remarkable biodiversity, tuataras and, et cetera, kiwis. You could remove those predators, those invasives, simply through gene editing. Should we do it? Well, given the amount of taxpayer dollars that go into trying to prevent those invasions to begin with, you might think that's actually
Mm.
financially reasonable, and it attains the very goal that's been, New Zealanders' goal for many, many years, et cetera. So I don't think we can rule those things out. Now, that goes beyond ameliorating harms. It asks us to intervene, but I think there could be circumstances out of a general duty of, say, benevolence, right? That we might. The one thing I would just say to this is that whenever we think about the wrongs of species extinction and our duties to intervene, they're always prima facie. There always can be things that countervail in those
Mm.
obligations that could remove them when they're present or add them when they weren't. So, this is partly why this is such an interesting area to work in, because it's so complex and the scientific, metaphysical, ethical issues are so rich.